Hello, my friend. Settle in, get comfortable. Because where we're going tonight is somewhere most people believe they already understand, and by the end of this, you'll see you didn't. Not really. Just a brief moment before we start. If these quiet evenings have turned into a bit of a habit for you, subscribing would mean more than you realise. Let me know in the comments where you're resting tonight. Maybe a quiet bedroom in Manchester, or a cosy couch somewhere in Ohio. I read every single one, truly. Alright, love, pull that blanket up. Let's begin. Tonight we're talking about what life was truly like for women in ancient Rome. And before we settle in, let me tell you a few things that might genuinely surprise you. Roman women had no legal right to vote, hold public office, or appear in court on their own behalf. And yet some of them wielded enormous political influence, orchestrating alliances, managing fortunes, and quietly directing the fates of emperors. A Roman girl could be legally married as young as 12 years old, and the average woman had been through at least one marriage before she was 20. The Romans had a word, univira, meaning a woman who had married only once and stayed faithful to her husband even after his death, and they considered her so admirable they carved it onto tombstones as the highest possible compliment. Women of means in ancient Rome wore wigs made from the hair of conquered Germanic and Gallic slaves, dyed their hair red and blonde and black with substances that included rendered goat fat, beechwood ash, and sometimes leeches soaked in vinegar. And Roman physicians, writing with complete seriousness, recommended that a woman who wanted to stay healthy should avoid excessive reading, because mental exertion was believed to overheat the brain and disrupt her natural feminine constitution. That is the world we're stepping into tonight. Dim the lights if you can. Let the fan run soft. Settle down under your blanket and let us travel back, not to the Rome of triumphs and marble forums, but to the Rome of small rooms and oil lamps, and women navigating an entire civilization that was simultaneously fascinated by them and determined to keep them manageable. Picture a city in the year 50 BCE. Rome is enormous by any standard the ancient world has yet produced. Perhaps 1 million people, possibly more, crammed into an urban landscape of apartment blocks, and cooking smoke and noise and the constant smell of the Tiber on a warm day. The streets are narrow enough that neighbours on opposite sides could lean out their windows and pass things between their hands. The sounds start before dawn, the creak of wagon wheels because wheeled traffic was banned during the day, and so every merchant and builder worked the streets in darkness, and the city rang and clattered through the nighttime hours with a continuous low-grade chaos that residents apparently stopped noticing after a while. Into this world, let us introduce a woman. Her name, and this is the first thing you need to understand about Roman naming conventions, which are genuinely fascinating, is almost certainly a feminized version of her father's family name. If her father was from the Cornelia family, she was Cornelia. If her father was a Julius, she was Julia. Roman women of the citizen class did not typically have individual given names the way Roman men did. They were identified by their family. If there were 2 daughters, one might be called Cornelia Major and the other Cornelia Minor, Cornelia the elder and Cornelia the younger. That was the extent of it. The woman belonged to the family name before she belonged to herself, and the naming system made that perfectly clear before she could speak a word. Let us call our woman Claudia, because Claudia was one of the most common feminine names in Rome, the female version of the patrician Claudius family, and common enough to span the full social spectrum from senatorial household to freedwoman to slave. Claudia is 23 years old. She's been married for 9 years. She has 2 living children and has lost one. She lives in a moderately prosperous household on the Aventine Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills, in a neighbourhood that mixes old Roman families with wealthy freedmen and successful merchants. Her husband is a businessman, not a senator, not a general, but a man with connections and property and enough money that Claudia has a household of perhaps a dozen slaves. She woke this morning before sunrise, not by choice exactly. The apartment block where the family occupies the lower 2 floors is not a quiet place, and the city had been rattling and clanging below her window since the 3rd hour of the night. Claudia is accustomed to this. Every Roman woman of any class was accustomed to this. Insomnia was so common in Rome that poets wrote about it, philosophers complained about it, and physicians developed elaborate theories about why the city air itself was too agitated to allow proper rest. The satirist Juvenal, writing a little over a century after our Claudia's time, described the sounds of Rome at night as something close to torture. The cartwheel grinding on stone, the argument breaking out in the bakery, the man upstairs who couldn't seem to move across his floor without every footstep landing like a small hammer blow. Claudia sits up in the morning darkness, her eyes already adjusting to the faint light coming through the high, narrow window. Her sleeping room is small by modern standards. The Romans called it a cubiculum, and the name gives you the sense of it. A cube, a box, a contained private space. In wealthy houses, this room might be painted with elaborate frescoes, the walls done in deep ochre and Pompeian red with architectural illusions designed to make the space feel larger than it was. Even in modest rooms, the walls were usually plastered and painted in some colour. The Romans had a profound dislike for bare walls. Leaving a wall undecorated suggested either poverty or a kind of aesthetic carelessness that respectable people found mildly embarrassing. The bed is called a lectus. In better households it would be made of wood inlaid with ivory or bronze fittings, resting on leather straps or webbing stretched across a frame, with a mattress stuffed with wool or feathers or, in less fortunate households, straw. The Romans slept with cushions and bolsters and coverings made of wool, and in winter the cold in a Roman house could be surprisingly fierce, because the Romans, despite their famous hypercaust heating systems, did not pipe warmth into every room equally. The triclinium, the dining room, the public rooms, these were where effort was made. Private sleeping quarters might or might not catch the benefit, depending on the layout of the house. Claudia does not dress herself alone. This is perhaps the first thing to understand about a Roman woman's mourning. It was not a solo production. A slave or two waited on her, helping with clothing and hair and the particular rituals of presentation that Roman culture invested with enormous social significance. The slave who attended to Claudia's person was called an ornatrix, a word that comes from the Latin verb meaning to adorn or to decorate, and the ornatrix was a specialized kind of servant whose skill set was specifically focused on the body and appearance of her mistress. The relationship between a Roman woman and her ornatrix was one of the genuinely intimate human threads of the ancient world, and it is worth pausing on it for a moment. The ornatrix spent more time in direct physical contact with her mistress than almost anyone else in the household. She dressed her, she arranged her hair, she applied her cosmetics, mixed her perfumes, helped her bathe, accompanied her to the baths, knew her body's every particular, the mole on the left shoulder, the scar from childbirth, the way the hair grew at the nape of her neck, and this intimate knowledge existed inside a relationship that was at its legal core one of absolute ownership. The ornatrix was property. Her mistress could have her beaten for a bad hairstyle. Roman sources, written by men with their particular tendency to find female vanity amusing, describe wealthy women throwing hairpins at their ornatrices, slapping them, having them whipped, because a curl sat wrong, or a braid came undone at an inopportune moment. There is a Roman poet named Ovid who gives a piece of advice in his work on cosmetics. He says that a woman whose hair has come undone in his presence had better not blame it on the ornatrix too loudly, because the violence she would do to the slave girl would make her look monstrous. It is a telling little moment. The violence was assumed. The only question was whether to perform it publicly. But let us not reduce that relationship to only its cruelty, because the historical record is more complicated than that. There are tomb inscriptions, and Roman funerary inscriptions are one of the most extraordinary windows into the lives of ordinary people, because ordinary people in Rome were commemorated in stone with remarkable frequency. There are tomb inscriptions from women mourning their ornatrices with what reads as genuine grief. Women freed their ornatrices as a gesture of long service and affection. Some ornatrices became wealthy in their own right. freed and then employed as professional hairstylists for hire. The skill was real and it was valued, and the intimacy of the work created bonds that the legal categories of slavery and freedom could not always contain. Claudia's ornatrix this morning is a woman named Phyllis, a Greek name common for slaves of Greek origin or Greek education, and many of Rome's household slaves were Greek. Phyllis is perhaps 30 years old, more experienced than Claudia in certain matters, completely powerless in others, and they have arrived at the particular equilibrium of their relationship over years of daily proximity. Phyllis knows when Claudia is irritable and adjusts her touch accordingly. She knows which style Claudia's husband prefers and which one Claudia herself prefers, and how to navigate the gap between those two preferences without making either choice feel like a concession. Hair in ancient Rome was not a minor matter. This deserves emphasis because the modern eye looks at Roman portrait busts and paintings and might see simply hair, but Roman women and the men who watched them understood hairstyle as a language, a whole visual vocabulary of social meaning that was legible to anyone paying attention. In the Republican period, the period of Claudia's time, respectable Roman women wore their hair pulled back and arranged simply, braided, coiled, secured at the nape or the crown with pins and combs. The severity of the style signaled something. It said, "I am a Roman matron. I am not a performer, not a prostitute, not a foreign woman with her hair falling around her face in loose waves that were considered both sensual and vaguely untrustworthy." The tight arrangement of Roman hair said discipline, and discipline in a woman was a virtue. Hairpins were made of bone, ivory, bronze, silver, gold, depending on what you could afford. They were long, pointed, often decorated at the top with carved figures, a hand, a crescent moon, a small goddess. Combs were made of boxwood, ivory, bone. Some women owned small ivory hairpieces, partial wigs designed to add volume to an upswept style, and the practice of wearing full wigs, particularly wigs made from the hair of Germanic slaves, which came in the coveted shades of red and blonde that Roman women with their typically dark hair envied. This practice was well established by the imperial period that followed. Phyllis works in near silence this morning, drawing a comb through Claudia's hair with practiced care, beginning at the ends and working upward, because she has done this enough times to know that the other approach produces tangles that Claudia will feel in her scalp for the rest of the day. The oil lamp on the stand beside the polished bronze mirror gives off a soft, jumping light, and in that light Claudia examines her own reflection with the focused attention of a woman who knows that her face is a kind of public text that the day will require her to read aloud. Cosmetics in ancient Rome were a subject of considerable cultural ambivalence, and if you want to understand how Roman society thought about women, you could do worse than starting with the question of makeup. The ambivalence went something like this. Roman men simultaneously expected their wives to be beautiful and criticized them for making any effort toward beauty. They wanted the natural appearance of a healthy, well-cared-for woman, and they dismissed the means of achieving that appearance as vain, deceptive, even dangerous. It is the same contradiction that has followed women's beauty practices through essentially every century since, and the Romans had it in full. Women used chalk powder and white lead, the same lead that we now know was slowly poisoning them, to whiten and even the skin of their faces and necks. They used a red pigment called fucus for lips and cheeks, made from ochre and wine lees and sometimes from a substance derived from the mulberry plant. They darkened their eyebrows with soot or antimony, a metallite mineral that also served as what we might think of as eyeliner, drawn along the lash line to make the eyes appear larger and deeper. They treated their skin at night with pastes and preparations made from everything from barley water and ground fenugreek to swan fat, crocodile dung in dissolved form. Used apparently as a skin whitener, recorded in Pliny the Elder's Natural History without evident irony, and a preparation made from crushed rose petals and vinegar that probably smelled quite nice and probably did nothing except make the room smell of roses and vinegar. There was a Roman writer named Ovid, the same poet who mentioned the ornatrix, who wrote an entire short text on women's cosmetics, the Medicamina Faciae Feminae. He gives recipes, he is mostly helpful about it, he seems to genuinely enjoy the subject, and then in other texts he is withering about women who wear too much and whose beauty, he says, is not their own but borrowed from the apothecary's shop. Both impulses existed simultaneously in the same man and, by extension, in the culture. Claudia applies a small amount of chalk preparation to her face and neck this morning, enough to smooth the complexion and reduce the redness around her jaw, and she lets Phyllis darken her brows with a fine stick of charcoal, and that is most of it. She is not going out to a dinner party today. Today is an ordinary day, and for an ordinary day a moderate hand is appropriate. While Phyllis finishes pinning Claudia's hair into its coiled arrangement, let us talk about what Claudia is actually wearing, because Roman women's clothing is one of those subjects that sounds simple from a distance and reveals layers of meaning the closer you look. The base garment was the tunica, a simple rectangular piece of linen sewn at the shoulders and belted at the waist. This is what a Roman woman wore against her skin. Some women also wore a band called a strophium, a strip of linen or leather wound around the chest for support, the functional ancestor of the modern bra, though far less structured. Over the tunica, a Roman matron of citizen status wore the stola, a long overdress that fell to the floor and was often pleated and belted. The stola was not just a garment, it was a marker. It said, "I am a Roman wife. I am respectable. I am under the law's protection and the law's authority in equal measure." Prostitutes, actresses, and women who had lost their claim to respectability through adultery or other means were, by law and custom, forbidden from wearing the stola. They wore the toga instead, the toga, that iconic symbol of Roman citizenship, which was applied to women as a kind of branding, a visible flag that said, "This woman is outside the category of the respectable matron." Over everything, when going outside, a Roman woman wore the palla, a large rectangular shawl that could be draped in various ways, including pulled up over the head as a kind of hood when the wearer wanted an additional degree of modesty or protection from sun or rain. The palla was the Roman woman's all-purpose outer garment, and the way a woman arranged it, whether it fell from both shoulders or was gathered under one arm, or draped loosely or pulled close, was as legible a piece of personal style as anything we might read from a modern woman's choice of coat. Colours were significant. Bright colours were associated with wealth and celebration, and also with a certain amount of what we might call social boldness. Saffron yellow, Tyrian purple, the famous purple derived from the murex sea snail, so expensive that its dye was literally worth more by weight than silver. Phoenician crimson, peacock blue. These were the colours of the wealthy and the ambitious. Modest matrons tended toward undyed wool, pale yellow, soft blues and greens, and white. But there was a whole spectrum of socially acceptable colour between those poles, and Roman women of means navigated it with the attention and precision of people who understood that appearance was never merely personal. It was always also a communication directed outward at everyone who could see you. Sandals were the primary footwear, though closed leather shoes were also worn, particularly in cold weather. Rich women might have sandals with gilded leather straps or shoes dyed with expensive pigments. The soles were typically hobnailed for durability on the stone-paved streets of Rome, and you can still see in the archaeological record of Pompeii and Herculaneum the marks those hobnails left in the soft volcanic stone of doorway thresholds, the literal footprint of Roman women going about their days. Claudia is dressed now, hair done, face prepared. It is probably the second or third hour of the day. The Romans divided daylight into 12 equal hours regardless of season, which meant that a summer hour was longer than a winter hour, a fact that would cause modern people enormous confusion, but seemed to cause the Romans no trouble at all, and the house is already awake around her. Let us talk about this house, because it matters. Roman houses were arranged around a central hall called the atrium, an open or partly open space with an impluvium at its centre, a shallow square pool designed to catch rainwater falling through the opening in the roof above. The atrium was the public face of the house, the space where a householder received clients and morning visitors, where the family's ceremonial life was centered, where the images of the family ancestors, wax portrait masks kept in cabinets along the walls, were displayed. It was, in a meaningful sense, the political heart of a Roman home. Behind the atrium lay the more private rooms, the tablinum, where the head of household conducted business, the triclinium, where the family dined, and beyond those the peristyle garden if the house was large enough, a colonnaded courtyard with plants and possibly a fountain. Roman homes that could afford it turned inward, opening onto their central garden rather than outward onto the street. The street-facing walls were often blank, occasionally occupied at ground level by shops or tabernae that the household either ran or rented out. Inside, though, the air was different, quieter, greener, filtered through the columns and the plants. Claudia's household is not one of the enormous houses you see reconstructed in books about Pompeii. It is comfortable and respectable, with a moderate peristyle garden where herbs and a few roses grow, and where the household's shrine to the Lares, the protective spirits of the home, is maintained. But it is not palatial. Space in Rome was expensive and carefully used, and even prosperous middle-class households tended to be more compact than their reputation for luxury might suggest. The kitchen, called the collina, is toward the back of the house, a dark and smoky room built around a waist-high masonry structure with charcoal braziers on top. There was no chimney in the modern sense. Cooking smoke simply rose and eventually drifted out through gaps and windows, which is part of why Roman kitchens were kept as far from the living spaces as possible, and why the ceilings above them tended to be black with soot. The Roman kitchen was not an inviting room. It was a workroom, a production space, and the slaves who cooked there, the culinary staff of even a modest household, worked in conditions that modern cooks would find genuinely difficult. This morning Claudia moves through the atrium toward the small room near the kitchen where the household's daily provisions are managed. This is one of the central practical facts of running a Roman household: the management of supplies, the distribution of food to family and slaves, the oversight of whatever purchasing needed to be done in the markets. The management of the household was a Roman wife's primary official domain, and it was not a small responsibility. A moderately sized Roman household consumed a remarkable quantity of food. The staple diet centered on grain, specifically emmer wheat or common wheat, ground into flour and made into bread or made into a thick grain porridge called pulse, that had been the primary food of Romans since the early Republic, and that retained a certain nostalgic, virtuous association even as the Roman diet grew more elaborate. Olives and olive oil were fundamental. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that showed up in nearly everything Romans cooked, savoury and deeply flavoured in a way that modern people comparing it to Worcestershire sauce or fish sauce get approximately right, was a constant. Wine, diluted with water in ratios that varied by occasion and quality, was drunk by adults of all classes, and the Romans regarded drinking undiluted wine as a sign of either barbarian origin or dangerous moral disorder. Claudia consults this morning with the household's head slave, a man named Marcus who manages the day-to-day operations of the house. She goes over the provisions situation, what needs to be purchased from the market, what the household's supply of oil looks like, whether the wine needs replacing, what the cook needs for the evening meal. Her husband Lucius will be entertaining a business associate tonight, which means the triclinium needs to be set, the food needs to be appropriate to the occasion, and Claudia needs to have thought about all of this before noon. Running a Roman household meant managing money, managing personnel, and making what amounted to daily executive decisions about the functioning of an organization that could include dozens of people. And Roman men, who in their literary and philosophical writings sometimes treated household management as a trivial female concern, relied on their wives to do this work completely and expected it to be done invisibly, without fuss, and without credit. Here is something the Roman sources reveal in their sideways way, the way sources always reveal things they are not quite trying to tell you. Roman men praised their wives effusively in funeral inscriptions and memorial texts, and the qualities they praised were almost universally domestic. She was lanificum, she worked wool, she managed the house, she was devoted, she was modest, she was chaste. The idealized Roman wife in the official record was a woman whose primary virtues were organizational and private. But the gap between the official ideal and lived reality is where the actual history lives, and Roman women's actual lives were considerably more complex and interesting than the inscriptions suggest. Let us follow Claudia out of the house for a while. Because a Roman woman did not simply stay indoors. This is one of the significant differences between Rome and ancient Athens, which confined respectable women quite strictly to the domestic sphere. Roman women went out. They visited temples, they went to the baths, they went to the markets, they attended games and theatrical performances and public festivals. They moved through the public city in a way that Greek women were largely not supposed to do, and the Roman city was designed at least in part with that in mind. The streets of Rome in the late Republic were a world unto themselves, narrow, crowded, noisy, smelling of cooking and animals and the Tiber, and unwashed bodies and perfume and cut flowers and the hot stone that the Mediterranean sun had been working on since dawn. The insulae apartment blocks rose 5 or 6 stories on either side, so that in the narrowest streets the sky was reduced to a bright stripe far overhead. The ground floors were almost always shops, a bakery with its round grinding stones and the loaves stacked near the doorway, a thermopolium where hot food was sold from countertop vessels set into the masonry, a fuller's shop where cloth was cleaned using human urine collected in big jars on the street corners. Passing citizens contributed, it was considered a public service. A cobbler's workbench just inside an open doorway, a barber's chair set out in front of his shop to catch the morning light. Claudia walks with Phyllis behind her. Going out with at least one attendant was expected for a woman of her status, partly practical and partly social signalling, and she carries herself with the particular upright Roman carriage that the culture valued in women, the unhurried walk that said she was going somewhere she had every right to go, and was in no particular hurry to explain herself to anyone. She has errands near the Forum Boarium, the old cattle market along the Tiber, where certain shops she prefers are located. The Forum Boarium is one of Rome's oldest market areas, and in Claudia's time it is surrounded by temples, the round temple of Hercules Victor with its columns still fresh with white paint, the temple of Portunus just beside it, and the neighbourhood has a mixed, busy quality that Rome's older districts tended toward, centuries of accumulated use visible in every building. The market itself is loud and immediate. Sellers of fish and of pottery and of second-hand goods call out. There are livestock pens that the Forum has never quite stopped being associated with, and the air is thick with all of it. Claudia knows the stalls she wants. She speaks directly with the vendors. There is nothing in Roman sources to suggest women had to be accompanied by men to conduct market transactions, and wealthy women apparently bargained as freely as men, and she makes her purchases for the household with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this many times before. She buys spices from an import merchant whose shop smells of cumin and coriander and something sweet and slightly medicinal that she can never quite identify but always buys. She inspects a small clay oil lamp with a figure of a running deer moulded on its discus and decides she wants it, and adds it to her purchases. The lamp is not a luxury in Roman terms, but lamps were a necessity of Roman domestic life, and choosing them was a particular kind of minor pleasure available to any woman who could spend a few copper asses on something that was both useful and pleasing. Roman oil lamps came in extraordinary variety, plain and elaborate, cheap terracotta and expensive bronze, decorated with mythological scenes and erotic images and gladiatorial fights and portraits of the emperor and pictures of chickens and fish and ordinary domestic objects. The moulded decoration on a Roman lamp tells you something about the visual world that ordinary people lived in, and that world was richer and stranger and more image-saturated than the bare word antiquity suggests. Now let us talk about something that is almost never in the popular picture of ancient Rome, which tends to favor gladiators and senators and architectural grandeur. Let us talk about the legal position of Roman women, because it was genuinely unusual, and its complications shaped every aspect of Claudia's life, in ways both visible and invisible. In the earliest Roman legal tradition, women were under perpetual guardianship. This system, called tutela, meant that a woman was legally under the authority of a male guardian, her father while he lived, her husband if she was married cum manu, a form of marriage that transferred a woman fully into her husband's family and legal power, or a male relative otherwise. She could not conduct legal transactions, make a will, or manage property without her guardian's involvement. But by Claudia's time, the late Republic, this system had been significantly eroded in practice, and in some ways had become nearly fictional. Most guardians of adult women, Roman legal sources confirm with barely concealed exasperation, had been reduced to rubber stamps. A woman who needed her guardian's consent for a transaction simply found a guardian who would give it. The legal requirement remained on paper while the practical reality of female economic activity made a mockery of it. Roman women of the propertied classes routinely managed their own money, owned property, made loans, conducted business, all with the nominal involvement of a guardian who was in practice barely involved at all. What this means is that Claudia, as a Roman woman of citizen status and moderate prosperity, lived in a legally awkward position that Roman society had not quite resolved. She was simultaneously less than a full legal person, dependent on male authorization for the forms, and genuinely economically powerful within the household, and increasingly within the wider economy. She was protected and constrained by the same legal frameworks. She had no vote, no public voice, no official standing, and yet the accumulated evidence of Roman inscriptions and documents shows women all over the empire conducting independent economic activity, making donations to temples, funding buildings, running businesses, lending money at interest, doing all the things that legal theory said they could not fully do on their own. The aristocratic Roman woman operated in a different dimension of this contradiction. A woman like Servilia, the mother of Marcus Brutus and longtime companion of Julius Caesar, or Livia, the wife of Augustus Caesar, or Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, these women wielded influence that was openly acknowledged and sometimes feared, even while the official ideology insisted women had no proper place in political life. Fulvia actually commanded troops during the Perrusine War of 41 BCE, a fact recorded by ancient sources not with the neutral tone they used for male military commanders, but with various degrees of scandal and disbelief. Women were not supposed to do this. Some of them did it anyway, and this is one of the things about ancient Rome that I find genuinely compelling once you sit with it long enough. The gap between the ideology and the reality was enormous, and everybody knew it, and almost nobody publicly acknowledged it. The ideal Roman woman was domestic, modest, silent, wool-working, self-effacing. Actual Roman women of means were frequently nothing of the sort. The gap between those two things is where the interesting history lives. Let us follow Claudia back toward home, because the morning is advancing and there are things that need to happen before the midday, and she is a person who prefers to be ahead of her obligations rather than chasing them. On the way she passes the public fountain. Rome's extraordinary system of aqueducts brought water into the city in quantities that were, by ancient standards, staggering, and the water ran continuously from public fountains throughout the day, and ordinary Romans who did not have private water connections, which was most Romans, collected their water here. Slaves carrying amphorae, women with clay jugs, children sent to fetch water for cooking. The public fountain was one of the genuinely communal spaces of Roman daily life, a place where people waited together and talked, and the social texture of that waiting and talking is something we mostly have to imagine from small references scattered through the sources. We should talk about the baths because the baths were central to Roman daily life in a way that is difficult to overstate, and Roman women's relationship to the baths is a fascinating small study in how Roman society negotiated privacy, pleasure, and propriety. The great Roman baths, the thermae, were public buildings of extraordinary size and ambition. Even the more modest balnea, neighborhood baths, of which Rome had hundreds, were genuine social institutions. You paid a small entrance fee, so small that it was essentially symbolic, a fraction of an as, and children were often admitted free, and inside you found a sequence of rooms moving from cold to warm to hot, with pools of varying temperatures, a dressing room, often an exercise yard or palestra, and a whole range of services available for additional fees. Oil for rubbing down, scrapers called stridules for removing the oil and sweat and dead skin from your body, masseurs, hair removal specialists who used resins and tweezers and possibly hot pitch, depending on the source you are reading and how much you trust it. Roman men and women bathed separately in most facilities, either in separate hours or separate sections. The question of whether mixed bathing occurred is one that the ancient sources debate with the particular energy they reserve for moral questions, which is to say that some sources condemn it in tones suggesting it was happening regularly, and some sources mock the whole concern. And the truth is probably that practices varied enormously by place and period and type of establishment. At the height of the imperial period, some emperors issued edicts forbidding mixed bathing. Other emperors issued no such edicts. Some of the bathing establishments that have been excavated show a single set of facilities that could only have been used by one sex at a time, while others show separate wings. What we know with confidence is that Roman women of most social classes went to the baths regularly, and that the baths were genuinely social spaces, not just hygiene facilities. You went to the baths to wash, yes, but also to be seen, to have conversations, to hear the latest news and gossip, to conduct informal business, to spend time with friends. The satirists complained about the noise in the baths, the grunting of men exercising, the slapping of the masseurs' hands, the shouting of the refreshment sellers, the woman who sang while washing her hair in a register that apparently pierced the walls. The baths were loud and communal, and they were a genuine daily pleasure for a population that mostly lived in small, dim apartments without private bathing facilities. There was also a strong class dimension to the bathing experience. Wealthy women might have their own bath suites in their private villas, and going to the public baths was something they did less from necessity and more for the social aspect. Some wealthy women brought their own retinue of attendants to the baths. The ornatrix for hair, a masseur, perhaps a slave to carry the oil and stridule, making the excursion itself a small production of visible luxury. The woman who arrived at the baths with 4 attendants was advertising something as well as washing. For working women, for slaves going on their day off, for the wives of craftsmen and small merchants, the baths were a different kind of relief. The one part of the day when the heat and the water and the dim lamplight of the bathing rooms created something approaching relaxation, something away from the cramped quarters and the constant demands and the noise of Roman everyday life. Now, let us go back to Claudia's house, because it is nearly midday, and the Roman midday brings its own rhythm. The midday meal, called the prandium, was typically light: bread, olives, cheese, fruit, cold cuts of leftover meat. Whatever was easy and available. The substantial meal of the Roman day was the cena, the evening dinner, and it was eaten in the late afternoon, usually starting somewhere in what we would call 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and lasting as long as the occasion required. On an ordinary day, this was a modest affair. On the evenings when Lucius entertained, it could extend well into the night. The Roman dinner party was a social institution of enormous importance, and the role of a Roman wife at her husband's dinner party was one of those fascinatingly double-edged things that characterize so much of Roman women's social position. On one hand, a Roman wife was expected to be present at her husband's dinner table. This was explicitly different from the Athenian practice, where respectable women did not eat with male guests. Roman women reclined at table alongside the men, and this was held up as evidence of Roman social sophistication. On the other hand, the behavior expected of women at these dinners was carefully circumscribed. They were present but not supposed to dominate, visible but not supposed to direct the conversation. part of the social occasion without being the occasion's subject. The triclinium, the dining room, was arranged around 3 couches, each sleeping 3 diners, hence the name. Diners reclined on their left side, propped on cushions, and ate with their right hands from a central low table. The food came in courses, first the gustatio, appetizers of eggs and salted fish and olives and vegetables pickled in vinegar, then the prima mensa, the main courses, which in an elaborate dinner could run to many dishes, roasted meats, stewed dishes, elaborate preparations that demonstrated the cook's skills, and then the secunda mensa, the dessert course of fresh and dried fruits, honey-sweetened pastries, nuts. Wine ran throughout. The quality of food served at a Roman dinner party was itself a communication. To offer guests food that was abundant and varied and well prepared was to demonstrate status, generosity, and the kind of household management that reflected well on both host and hostess. To offer thin wine and meagre portions was to invite social commentary of the unkind variety. Claudia would have known this in the way she knew the back of her hand, and the planning she did this morning, the conversation with Marcus about provisions, the market purchases, the consultation with the cook about what could be made from what was available, was all directed toward this evening's performance of hospitality. Now let us spend a little time with something that was both deeply ordinary and quietly complex in Roman women's lives, the question of religion. Rome was a polytheistic society of considerable religious richness and variety, and women's religious lives were both central and peripheral in ways that reflected the larger pattern of their social position. Women were excluded from many of the official state religious offices, the augurs who read divine signs, the flamines who served specific major gods, the various priestly colleges that managed Rome's religious calendar. These were male preserves, but women had their own sphere of religious life, and some of it was specifically female and specifically powerful. The most famous of Rome's female religious officers were the Vestal Virgins, 6 priestesses who served the goddess Vesta, goddess of the hearth and the sacred fire that burned continuously in her round temple in the Roman Forum. The Vestals were chosen as girls between the ages of 6 and 10 from patrician families. They served for 30 years, during which time they were required to remain chaste. They lived in a large residence next to Vesta's temple in the Forum, and they enjoyed a set of legal and social privileges that were remarkable for women in Rome. A Vestal could make a will without a guardian. She could free a slave by meeting one on the street. She had a reserved place of honor at public games and spectacles. If she met a condemned prisoner being led to execution, her presence was sufficient grounds for his pardon. The condition attached to all this privilege was absolute chastity. A Vestal found to have broken her vow was buried alive in a small underground chamber, not executed by human hands because spilling her blood was considered taboo, but left to die underground with a few days' provisions, a lamp, and whatever prayers she might manage. It happened. The historical record preserves names. The terror this punishment represented was presumably part of what kept the institution functioning. There is something almost incomprehensible to the modern mind about the combination of extraordinary privilege and absolute restriction that the Vestals embodied. They were simultaneously among the most powerful women in Rome and among the most constrained. For ordinary women like Claudia, religious life centered on the household gods, the Lares and Penates, whose small shrines existed in Roman homes everywhere, and on the participation in public religious festivals that dotted the Roman calendar throughout the year. Some of these festivals were specifically for women. The Bona Dea festival, dedicated to the good goddess, was an all-female ceremony conducted in the home of the senior magistrate and from which men were so strictly excluded that even male animals were removed from the house on the day of celebration. The all-female religious event was not a marginal practice in Rome. It was an institution with deep roots and serious social meaning, a space in which women's religious authority operated fully and visibly and without male oversight. Claudia keeps the shrine in her peristyle garden with attention. She places small offerings, a bit of incense, a sprig of rosemary, a small cake made with spelt flour in the traditional recipe, on the anniversary dates appropriate to the various gods her family honors. She says her prayers in the practical, direct Roman way, which was considerably less devotional in the modern sense and more transactional. I offer this, you give me that. Roman religion operated on a principle called do ut des, I give so that you may give, and the relationship between worshipper and deity was expected to be a kind of reciprocal negotiation. You fulfilled your obligations, the gods fulfilled theirs. Failure on either side was noticed. There is a passage in a Roman author, I believe it is in Tibullus, one of the elegiac poets, writing in the generation just before the Common Era, where a man describes watching the woman he loves perform her devotions at a roadside shrine, and the image he gives is of her intense, absorbed concentration, the way she prays as if the goddess is genuinely there, as if the stones and incense and murmured words are the fabric of a real communication. I have always found that passage unexpectedly moving. It is one of those moments where the ancient world stops being historical and becomes simply human. Let us talk about children, because the children were a constant of Claudia's life, and the Roman experience of childhood was very different from our own in ways that matter. The infant mortality rate in ancient Rome was by modern standards devastating. Estimates vary widely because the evidence is fragmentary, but the best current thinking among historians suggests that perhaps 30 to 35% of children born in Rome did not survive past age 5. The loss of young children was so common that it was woven into the fabric of Roman life in ways both practical. The Romans often did not name children until they were several days old, a small hedge against attachment to a child who might not survive, and deeply emotional. The evidence from Roman tombs and epitaphs shows parents mourning children with an anguish that no amount of historical distance makes less recognizable. Claudia has lost one child, a girl who died at 8 months from what the Romans would have called a fever. She has 2 living children, a son who is 7, named Lucius after his father according to Roman tradition, and a daughter who is 5, named Claudia Minor. The son attends a school run by a Greek freedman in the neighborhood, where he is learning to read and to do arithmetic on a wax tablet, and he will soon begin the more rigorous study of rhetoric and literature that Roman education for boys of his class required. The daughter is at home, learning from her mother and from Phyllis and from the texture of the household itself, the things Roman girls of her station were expected to know. This is one of the genuine fault lines of Roman society that is easy to overlook if you are focused on the patrician class and its ambitious daughters. Claudia's daughter will be educated. She will learn to read and write. She will learn enough arithmetic to manage a household account. She will learn music and perhaps some history and the rudiments of rhetoric. Roman women of the educated classes were expected to be literate and reasonably learned, and there are references throughout Roman literature to women who argued philosophy, discussed literature, composed poetry, wrote letters of considerable sophistication. But her education will be in service of her role as wife and mother and household manager. Her brother's education will be designed to launch him into public life, into the forum and the courts and the political machinery of the Roman state. Hers will not. And yet, and here is that gap again, some Roman women entered the intellectual life of their time through the side door of private patronage and personal connection, and their influence was real. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, was praised in antiquity as a model of Stoic education and influence. She educated her sons herself, and they became 2 of the most important reformers of the late Republic, and the letters attributed to her with scholarly debate about authenticity show a formidably clear and forceful mind. Sulpicia was a poet whose work survived in the corpus of Tibullus, and her poems about her own erotic experience are written with a directness and literary sophistication that tell you she was fully literate in the Roman poetic tradition, even while she was operating in the tradition's margins. Aspasia, whose influence on Athenian intellectual life we know primarily through her Roman admirers, was held up as an example of female intellectual power by writers who were simultaneously uncertain what to make of the phenomenon. The afternoon is advancing now. Claudia has been through much of what needs to happen before evening, and there is a moment, it arrives most days, somewhere in the middle of the afternoon when the preparations are in hand and the children are occupied, and Lucius is still at whatever business occupies him. There is a moment when the house is as quiet as a Roman house ever gets, and Claudia sits in the peristyle garden in the cool of the colonnade, with something small in her hands, a piece of wool she is working, or a letter she is reading, because she does correspond regularly with her sister in Campania and with a friend who married into a Neapolitan household 2 years ago. Woolworking, lanificium, was the single most consistently praised activity in all of Roman literature devoted to female virtue. The model Roman woman worked wool. She spun, she wove, she produced the cloth from which the household's clothing was made. The Emperor Augustus, famous for his conservative social values, allegedly wore only clothing made by his wife Livia and his female relatives. Tomb inscriptions across the Roman world return to the phrase domum servavit, lanum fecit. She kept the house, she made wool, as if it summarizes everything that matters about a woman's life. And in a practical sense, it did represent something real. Textile production in the ancient world was a genuine economic activity of enormous scale, and the household contribution to that production was significant. Woolworking was also the activity that most clearly distinguished the respectable matron from the idle and the disreputable. A woman with a spindle in her hand was by visual convention a woman whose time was accounted for, whose virtue was visible in her industry. It was the ancient equivalent of looking busy, but it was also sometimes simply something to do with your hands while your mind was elsewhere. And Claudia's mind, this particular afternoon, is following a thread that has been occupying her for some days. Her husband wants her to consider a possible match for their daughter, their 5-year-old daughter, which gives you a sense of the timeline Roman aristocratic families were working with, between Claudia Minor and the son of a business associate named Maevius. The boy is 9. The negotiation, if it proceeds, would involve betrothals now and an actual marriage perhaps 7 or 8 years from now, when both children are of legal age. Claudia has views on this. Roman women had views on the marriages of their children that were not always identical to their husbands' views, and the historical record gives us glimpses of these negotiations, these conversations where women pushed back or maneuvered or managed to redirect outcomes. But the formal legal authority over a Roman child was the patria potestas, the power of the father, a power so absolute in the early republic that it technically included the right of life and death over his children, though this extreme had long been mitigated in practice by the time of our story. Claudia's views matter, and she knows they matter, and Lucius knows they matter, and simultaneously the law is clear about who holds the formal authority. This is the ordinary politics of Roman marriage. The stakes were high. Marriage alliances were a major mechanism for social and economic advancement in a society without public elections based on anything but ancestry and money, and women were simultaneously central to those alliances. They were the currency of the alliance, in a sense that is not entirely comfortable to contemplate, and active participants in negotiating them. The mother's advice and assessment and preferences were not supposed to count officially and counted enormously in practice. There is a letter from Cicero, the great orator and politician of the late Republic, a man whose correspondence survives in extraordinary volume and gives us a window into elite Roman life of unparalleled intimacy. There is a letter from Cicero describing his daughter Tullia's disastrous third marriage, the marriage she apparently wanted and he was reluctant about, and the tone is of a man who has been maneuvered by his daughter and his ex-wife, from whom he was divorced, into a situation he didn't choose. The details are complicated in the way that family situations always are, but what it shows, reading between the lines, is that Tullia had preferences and expressed them, and that Cicero's correspondence with his ex-wife Terentia was full of practical domestic and financial negotiation that bore no resemblance to the official picture of a Roman woman who simply deferred to her husband's decisions. Terentia managed property, negotiated with creditors, made independent decisions about the household in Cicero's absence, and wrote him letters of considerable clarity about what she expected from him. The evening is approaching. Let us talk about it. The Roman evening meal, the cena, was the social and emotional center of the Roman day, and when it involved guests, as tonight's does, it required a precision of preparation and execution that fell largely on Claudia's shoulders, even though Lucius would be the one reclining at the head of the central couch and directing the conversation and receiving the credit for the hospitality. Claudia has changed her dress. For an evening with guests, the stola she wears is finer, wool dyed to a soft blue-green that suits her complexion, the pleats falling straight from the shoulder, a narrow band of embroidered edging at the hem and cuffs in a design of stylized leaves. Her hair is redone by Phyllis with more elaboration than the morning arrangement, a coiled style that allows a few loose tendrils to fall at her temples in the fashion considered becoming for a woman of her age and position. She is wearing more jewelry now, gold earrings in the shape of crescent moons, a gold necklace with a single large emerald pendant. This is the kind of piece that a Roman family of comfortable means would own and wear on social occasions, displaying wealth in the discreet way the Roman matron was supposed to. And rings on several fingers, because Romans wore rings with the enthusiasm that later centuries devoted to brooches. Roman jewelry was extraordinary. The archaeological finds from Pompeii and Herculaneum and from Roman sites all over the empire show a level of goldsmith skill and decorative imagination that is genuinely breathtaking. Snake bracelets coiled from shoulder to elbow, their scales individually worked in fine wire. Earrings with tiny articulated gold drops hanging below tiny gold seed shapes. The movements involved in making these objects, with the tools available in the 1st century, would challenge a modern jewelry maker. The Phaeum portraits from Roman Egypt, painted on wooden panels to be attached to mummies, show women of various social levels wearing jewels of astonishing quality. Pearls in clusters at the ears, heavy gold collars, arm bracelets of hammered gold, rings stacked on fingers, and you can see in those painted faces a composed directness, a self-possession that no amount of historical remove erases. The guests arrive. Maevius and his wife, the potential father-in-law and his own wife, a woman named Fabia who is the kind of large, confident, socially capable Roman matron who seems to occupy every room she enters with the ease of someone who has been doing it for decades. There is another couple as well, a freedman named Titus who has done well in the spice trade and his wife. The company is mixed in the Roman way. Social ties in Rome crossed class lines in both directions, and the dinner table was often where those crossings were most visible. Claudia greets them. Her greeting is warm, precisely calibrated. There is an entire language of Roman social greeting, the formal kiss on the cheek between friends and associates, a hand clasp, the particular phrases of welcome, and Claudia moves through it fluently, directing the slaves to take cloaks, ensuring the guests are settled comfortably on the couches arranged for the evening, and positioning herself with the practiced ease of a woman who has hosted many times before. The conversation over dinner tonight begins where much Roman dinner conversation began. The news. Rome was a city of extraordinary information density. Rumors, political developments, gossip, news from the provinces, and the Sena was one of its primary distribution networks. Lucius has information about troop movements in the east that he has been tracking for business reasons. Maevius has heard something interesting about a grain contract. Fabia knows that a woman of their acquaintance has been involved in a property dispute, the details of which are marvelously complicated and which she describes with a narrative skill that the whole table clearly appreciates. Wine arrives, mixed by the slave designated for that task at a ratio that Lucius has specified for this evening. The Romans were thoughtful about their wine ratios in a way that reflected both practical wisdom and social habit. Too strong and the conversation degraded into noise, too weak and the evening felt flat. The sweet spot was a subject of genuine interest. A lot of Roman social philosophy is really philosophy about the correct conduct of the Sena when you trace the ideas far enough back. Claudia says something about the property dispute Fabia has described. Her observation is brief, dry, and accurate, and draws a laugh from Titus's wife, who has been quiet until now. Claudia does not dominate the conversation. She does not stay silent either. She participates in the careful, intelligent way of a person who knows the value of speaking at the right moment and the value of listening the rest of the time. And she navigates the social dynamics of the table, the slightly competitive relationship between Lucius and Maevius, the fact that Titus's wife is new to this social circle and needs to be included rather than left stranded, with a deftness that goes completely unremarked because deftness, when it works, is invisible. The food comes in its courses. The cook has done well tonight. The dishes are well seasoned and attractively arranged, and the gustasio particularly, a platter of small preparations that includes marinated olives, pickled eggs, sliced salt fish with capers, and something involving roasted chestnuts in honey that people reach for twice, draws compliments. Claudia accepts these compliments on behalf of her household with the particular form of Roman modesty that credits the cook while not denying the hostess's role in directing the cook's efforts. Let us stop here for a moment to talk about Roman food more specifically, because I think it is one of the aspects of Roman daily life where modern people have the most inaccurate picture. The Roman diet that most people imagine, the famous vomitorium, the orgies of excess, the thousands of flamingos at a single meal, comes almost entirely from Roman satirists and moralists describing and exaggerating the behavior of the extremely wealthy and the extremely reckless. This is a bit like judging modern eating habits entirely from the most excessive things ever reported about celebrity party menus. It tells you about one extreme of Roman food culture, and it tells you that Roman writers found conspicuous overconsumption as fascinating to mock as modern writers do. But it does not tell you what ordinary people ate. Ordinary Romans ate well in terms of variety, but with a restraint that their own writers praised as virtue. Bread was the staple. Many Romans ate 3 or 4 pounds of bread a day, which was the foundation of their caloric needs. The bread was dense and wheat-based, and ranged from the dark, rough panes of the poor to the fine white bread made from carefully sifted flour that the wealthy preferred. Olive oil was fundamental and used in quantities that would astonish anyone raised in a Northern European food tradition. It went in cooking, it went on food, it was the universal fat of the Mediterranean diet in a way that butter was not. Garum, the fish sauce, was ubiquitous in Roman cooking in the same way that salt is in modern European cooking, not as a fish flavor specifically, but as an umami base, a depth of savory intensity that underpinned everything else. Modern cooks working with Roman recipes sometimes find that a small amount of fish sauce makes a Roman dish suddenly click into coherence. Vegetables were eaten extensively. Cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, turnips, lentils, chickpeas, broad beans. Fruit was consumed fresh in season. Rome's Mediterranean climate gave it figs and grapes and pomegranates and apples and pears, and preserved by drying or in honey for winter. Meat was eaten, but in the way that people in pre-industrial Europe generally ate meat, not at every meal as a significant item rather than a background one, and with a preference for pork that the Republic of Pordom observation captures reasonably well. Fish was widely consumed, particularly in the coastal and riverside areas, and the Romans had a particular weakness for small preserved fish, anchovies, sardines in their garum production and as a direct food. What Romans did not have access to and what this meant for the Roman diet is worth noting. They had no tomatoes, no potatoes, no corn, no chocolate, no chili peppers, no vanilla. They had no sugar in the modern sense. Honey was the primary sweetener. They had no coffee. They had no tea. The absence of these items, which are so fundamental to what we consider Mediterranean and European food, means that Roman food was flavored with a different palate entirely. Pepper was the most expensive and most prized spice, imported from India at great cost, and used as an almost universal condiment. Silphium, a plant now believed extinct, was so valuable that its resin sold for its weight in silver. Cumin, coriander, fenugreek, lovage, caraway, rue, bay, thyme, and dozens of other herbs and spices gave Roman cooking a flavor profile that was simultaneously more unfamiliar and more interesting than the stereotypes suggest. Apicius, the great Roman cookbook compiled in the 4th or 5th century CE from earlier recipe collections, gives us a window into this flavor world. And what you find there is a cuisine of genuine sophistication that used sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami in combinations that feel simultaneously ancient and oddly familiar. Honey and vinegar together, fish sauce and sweet wine, pepper and raisins. The Roman kitchen was not simple. Back to the evening. The cena at Claudia's table continues through its courses, through the conversation that ranges from business to gossip to a brief, warm discussion of a poetry reading that Fabia has recently attended, something apparently from a new poet of the school of Catullus or thereabouts, whose work she quotes with the inaccuracy and enthusiasm of genuine appreciation rather than scholarly precision. Someone makes a joke about the gods. Wine is poured again. The lamp flames lengthen slightly as the oil shifts. Eventually the guests depart. This is one of the things about Roman dinner parties that is different from modern entertaining. They tended to end at a reasonable hour, partly because the streets of Rome after dark were not pleasant. Roman law prohibited wheeled traffic during the day and allowed it at night, which meant the hours of darkness were filled with the grinding of cartwheels and the shouting of drivers and the whole industrial noise of a city conducting its logistics, and the night air carried smells and dangers and the occasional crime. Respectable people who had to travel home in the dark did so by litter, the enclosed sedan chair carried by slaves, or with torchlight and attendants. Most preferred to leave before the need became pressing. Claudia and Lucius see their guests out, exchange the appropriate final courtesies, and the house begins its closing rituals. The slaves carry out the dishes, the triclinium is set to rights, the lamps are extinguished one by one except for the small one kept burning in the corridor near the children's rooms throughout the night. Lucius mentions something briefly about the potential match, about Maevius's son, gauging Claudia's response. She gives him something between an agreement and a non-committal acknowledgement that she has heard him, which is a conversational form that wives throughout history have developed across all cultures for the same purpose. She has opinions, she will share them at a moment of her choosing. The house settles. The streets outside are loud with the night traffic of Rome, but the thickness of the walls moderates it to a background presence. The children were put to bed hours ago. Claudia sits briefly at the edge of the bed in her room, letting Phyllis take down her hair in the lamplight, and there is that moment again of the ornatrix's practiced hands moving through the pins and taking them out one by one, the hair loosening, the day's formal presentation dissolving, and Claudia sitting in the warm silence of her own room, with her face as much her own face as it ever gets. Before we follow Claudia into sleep, let us take a larger view. Let us think about the full span of a Roman woman's life, because I have been giving you one day, one woman, one particular class position. Roman women's lives were dramatically different depending on where in the social hierarchy they were located, and I want to honor some of that difference before we close. A slave woman in Rome had no legal personhood at all. She was property, pure and simple. She could not marry legally. The unions between slaves were called contubianium, literally tent partnership, with no legal recognition. Any children she had belonged to her master, not to her. She could be bought, sold, hired out, given away. Her body was not her own in the most fundamental sense. The sexual exploitation of female slaves in Rome was so pervasive and so thoroughly normalized that the legal and literary sources treat it as a matter of simple ownership. What is yours you may use as you see fit. The satirists occasionally made jokes about it. The Stoic philosophers occasionally expressed mild discomfort. No one changed the law. And yet of slavery is always painful, because it should not require an and yet. Within those brutal constraints, the lives of individual slave women were not simply flat despair. They formed relationships, had children they loved, developed skills and knowledge and identities, made friends, made enemies, made jokes, exercised what judgment and agency the situation allowed. The women who ran particular departments of large Roman households, the head of the kitchen, the keeper of the linen stores, the senior household accountant, held real power within their small domain even while they were owned. The ornatresses, the skilled body servants, built relationships with their mistresses that were, because humans will always find the human thing even in inhuman systems, sometimes complicated and sometimes genuinely tender. Freed women occupied a middle position, a slave who was freed, which happened with some frequency in Rome, as manumission was built into the economic logic of slavery as a form of incentive and reward, became a libertina, a freed woman. She was not fully free in the Roman legal sense. She owed certain obligations to her former owner, who became her patron, and there were restrictions on what offices and honors were open to her children. But she could marry legally, she could own property, she could run a business. Many of the businesses that show up in Rome's archaeological record, bakeries, fulleries, taverns, restaurants, weaving workshops, trading concerns, were run by freed women and freed men, and some of them prospered substantially. A handful of inscription records show freed women of considerable wealth, women who funded public buildings in the provincial towns where they had retired, who left substantial legacies to their children, who were commemorated by their communities with the kind of public monument usually reserved for the elite. The woman of the senatorial class, the highest tier of Roman society, lived in a world of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary scrutiny. Her behavior was observed, reported on, discussed, judged with an attention that had no equivalent for women of lower classes, because her family's honor was entangled with the empire's politics in ways that made her private life politically relevant. The women of Augustus Caesar's family, his daughter Julia, his granddaughter Julia, his wife Livia, his stepdaughter Antonia, these women lived lives of almost theatrical intensity, their marriages and divorces and reputations and alleged affairs woven into the political narrative of a regime still trying to establish its own legitimacy. Julia I was exiled by her father for what he called licentia, and what modern historians read as a complex web of political opposition dressed in personal accusation. She spent the last years of her life on an island, having been at the center of Roman society. The tension between the Roman ideal of the modest, wool-working, domestically focused matron and the reality of what women of wealth and ambition actually did and were is most visible in the biographies of these imperial women. Livia, wife of Augustus, is one of the most fascinating figures of the entire ancient world, a woman who lived to nearly 80 years old in an era when few people of any class reached that age, who survived 3 political regimes, who managed her own considerable property and wealth, who was publicly honored and privately powerful, and about whom there are rumors, starting from the ancient sources themselves, of a political influence so significant that her husband's success could not be fully separated from it. The ancient sources hated this. They could not quite decide whether she was admirable or monstrous, because she was both those things and neither, because she was a powerful woman in a system that had no legitimate category for her power. There is a historian named Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century CE, who describes Livia as having been almost a partner in her husband's domination is socium, and you can hear in that phrase both the grudging acknowledgement of her power and the discomfort it caused. A partner in domination, he means it as a criticism. It reads, from this distance, like a description, let us talk about medicine and the body, because the Roman woman's relationship with her body was shaped by medical ideas that were sometimes interesting and often alarming, and the whole subject tells you a great deal about how the Romans thought about women generally. Roman medicine was largely derived from Greek sources, specifically from the 4 humor theory associated with Hippocrates and expanded by Galen in the 2nd century CE. The 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, were believed to be the fundamental fluids of the body, and health consisted in their proper balance. Disease was imbalance. Treatment was rebalancing, usually through diet, exercise, rest, and the administration of various substances to counter whichever humor was in excess. Women in this framework were understood as fundamentally different from men in their humoral constitution. Women were cooler and wetter than men. Men were hotter and drier. This constitutional difference explained women's perceived characteristics, their softness, their less active natures, their tendency to emotional volatility, understood as the instability of a cool, wet system. It also explained menstruation, which the male physicians who wrote about it understood as the body expelling excess moisture that the hotter, drier male body processed instead into sweat and intellectual energy. The ancient sources on women's medicine are both fascinating as historical documents and deeply uncomfortable as reading, because the male gaze, the professional, scientific, thoroughly confident male gaze that produced them, is present on every page. Gynecology as a medical specialty existed in ancient Rome, and the Gynikeia of Soranus of Ephesus, written in the 2nd century CE, is the most complete surviving gynecological text from antiquity. Soranus was more rational and empirically careful than many of his contemporaries, and his text contains genuine clinical observation alongside the theoretical framework. He discusses contraception, the use of substances applied to the cervix, wool pessaries, timing methods, and abortion, and the management of pregnancy and childbirth, and the diseases of women, with a matter-of-fact clinical attention that is more informative than most ancient medical texts. Roman women gave birth at home, attended by a midwife, an obstetrix, who was often a freedwoman with specific training. The midwife would have been experienced in the physical management of birth, in positioning the woman, in assisting with difficult presentations, in managing postpartum complications. Physicians might be called if things went badly wrong, but the ordinary birth was primarily managed by women attending women, and the skill that was concentrated in these midwives over generations of practice was real, even if it operated without the understanding of germ theory or anesthesia that would have made it far safer. Maternal mortality in Rome was high by modern standards. We cannot put a precise number on it, but the archaeological and literary evidence suggests that death in childbirth, or shortly after, was a genuinely common cause of female mortality, and one that shaped the texture of Roman women's interior lives in ways we can only partly reconstruct. The anticipation of pregnancy as genuinely dangerous, the knowledge that women you knew had died in childbed, the private calculations about whether a known pregnancy would be survived, these were the background conditions against which every Roman woman's domestic life was lived. Contraception was practiced. The Roman sources give us evidence of multiple methods, from the frankly ineffective amulets containing things like a small piece of mule's ear canal, a remedy recorded without evident irony in several medical texts, to the potentially somewhat useful, the insertion of substances with astringent or spermicidal properties before intercourse, to the most reliable ancient method of family planning, which was exposure or abortion, exposure of unwanted infants, setting a newborn outside to die or be found by others, was legally and culturally acceptable in Rome in ways that are jarring to modern sensibility. A Roman father had the right in early Roman law to decide whether to acknowledge a new child. If he did not lift the child up, a gesture called tollere liberus, the child could be exposed. Some exposed children were found and raised by others, some died. The exposure of female infants was probably more common than the exposure of male infants, though the evidence does not give us rates we can be confident about. Abortion existed and was practiced, and the legal and moral status of abortion in Rome was complicated. There was no blanket legal prohibition in the Republican period. The argument made in Roman sources against abortion was most often framed not in terms of the fetus's rights, but in terms of the husband's rights. A wife who aborted a fetus was depriving her husband of an heir. Soranus, more practically, evaluates the relative safety of contraception versus abortion and recommends contraception on the grounds that it is safer for the woman's body. There is a poem by Ovid Ovid shows up repeatedly when we are talking about Roman women because he wrote about them with more sustained attention than almost any other ancient author. There is a poem in which he addresses his mistress Corinna after she has nearly died from an abortion, and the poem is simultaneously a man's grief at his lover's danger, a mild reproach that she risked herself, and an implicit acknowledgement that the decision was hers to make in ways that his grief complicates but does not override. It is a strange, moving, morally uncomfortable little poem. It is very Roman. I want to spend some time now talking about what Roman women's emotional and intellectual inner lives might have been like, what they thought about, what they cared about, what moved them, because this is the part of history that the documents make hardest to see directly, and that I think matters most. The problem with reconstructing Roman women's inner lives is that almost everything written about them was written by men. The male perspective, the male judgment, the male framing of what women were and did and felt. This is what the surviving literary record mostly consists of. The women who wrote did not leave texts that survived in the same volumes. Sulpicia's few extant poems, a handful of letters, some inscriptions. We are reading women primarily through the distorting lens of men writing about women, men who had interests and assumptions that shaped every word. And yet, there are moments when something gets through. There is a letter written by a woman named Cornelia to her son Gaius Gracchus, if the attribution is genuine, and scholars continue to debate it, but let us say it is, and in that letter she tells him that she is tired of his political struggles, that she has given her life to her family and does not want the family's name dragged through more controversy, that she is old and has earned some peace. The tone is direct, a little cold, exhausted. It reads like a real person. There are the graffiti of Pompeii, that extraordinary trove of ordinary voices preserved by the volcanic ash that also killed the city. Among the political slogans and obscene jokes and declarations of love and business advertisements, there are messages that seem to come from women, tender things, grieving things, angry things, a line scratched by someone who was in love, a complaint about someone who had wronged the writer. The archaeology cannot always tell us the sex of who scratched these lines, but some of them carry a particular quality. There are the grave inscriptions, thousands of them, from across the Roman Empire, where husbands commemorate wives with phrases that, while formulaic, sometimes break open into something personal. He says she was more than he deserved. He says the house is empty without her. He says he has no idea how to go on. And occasionally a wife commemorates a husband, or a daughter a mother, or a freed woman the mistress she served for 30 years and apparently loved. These inscriptions are the most direct voices we have from the vast majority of Roman women who left no literary record. What I find most striking about these inscriptions, reading them in collections, and there are scholars who have compiled and analysed hundreds of them, is the consistency with which they return to the same cluster of virtues: modesty, faithfulness, domestic care, warmth toward children, keeping the house, making wool. These words appear so often that you start to understand them not as descriptions of what individual women were, but as descriptions of what the culture valued and needed to say publicly about its women at the moment of their death. The women whose actual characters and capabilities the surviving sources give us any real information about. Livia, Terentia, Tullia, Sulpicia, the various Julias, the various Cornelias, were almost none of them simply the modest domestic paragons of the funerary formula. They were complex, capable, politically engaged, sometimes ruthless, sometimes tender, often ambitious, always navigating a system that did not give their complexity official room. The modesty formula was what Roman society needed to say. The actual women were something richer and more difficult. Let us follow Claudia through the rest of her life in fast strokes, because we have been with her long enough to have a sense of her, and now I want to give you the larger arc. She negotiates, successfully, a version of the marriage arrangement for her daughter that includes terms she feels are appropriate. The match proceeds. She has another child, a boy, who survives. Her husband's business has good years and difficult years. She manages the household through both, adjusting, adapting, finding the margin between what they have and what they need with the practiced frugality that Roman housewives were expected to maintain as a virtue even in prosperity. She visits the temples regularly. She maintains her friendships with Fabia, with her sister in Campania through letters, with a neighbor whose husband works in the legal profession and who brings interesting news from the courts. She ages in the particular way that Roman women aged. In a culture that had no concept of retirement for either sex, aging meant a gradual shift in the nature of your responsibilities, a transition from the demanding physical work of childbearing and child-rearing to the different demands of watching your children grow and managing their affairs, and eventually the position, a position of real social authority in a Roman family, of the senior woman, the mater familias in the fullest sense. Older Roman women held a kind of informal authority that the legal system never quite captured in formal terms, the grandmother's word in family councils, the mother-in-law's influence over a son's household, the older widow's management of her own property free of a husband's direction. After Lucius's death, he predeceases her, as Roman men of his generation and class fairly often did. Claudia finds herself legally in a position she has never been in before. She is a widow in the full Roman sense, controlling her own property, no longer subject to the marriage-based household authority that had structured her adult life. If she marries again, and Roman society expected widows to remarry, valued the univira but acknowledged the practical and political realities that made remarriage common, she will do so now with considerably more of her own standing in the negotiation. If she does not remarry, she will be one of the Roman widows who appears in inscriptions and documentary papyri, managing their own affairs with a directness that the legal theory of female guardianship was never quite able to contain. She was, in the end, a Roman woman. Not the ideal Roman woman of the literary formula, not the monster of the satirist's imagination, not the tragic victim of a system that only oppressed her, though it did oppress her in real and specific ways, and not the secret proto-feminist maneuvering cleverly within impossible constraints. She was a person living a life within the structures available to her, using what she had, her intelligence, her relationships, her practical knowledge of how households and families and social networks and small commercial economies worked, to make something good enough out of the time she had. The Romans would have called that a life well lived. The inscription over her grave would have said she was modest, faithful, domestic. It would have said she kept the house and worked wool. It would not have said that she was sharp, capable, occasionally frustrated, sometimes delighted, often tired, usually more complex than the words allowed. Those things went unrecorded because they went without saying, because they were so obviously true, so obviously human, that no one thought to write them down. Now let us spend our final stretch of this evening with the larger world of Roman women's lives, the things that shaped Claudia's experience but that went beyond the individual household, the wider patterns and practices and social structures that, when you understand them, suddenly make a lot of the day-to-day details fall into place. Let us talk about education, because it is one of the most interesting fault lines in Roman women's history. Roman education, formal education, the kind that happened in schools outside the home, was theoretically open to girls, at least in its elementary stages. Boys and girls together learnt to read and write and do basic arithmetic in the ludi, the elementary schools that were often held in open spaces or under porticos, the schoolmaster's chair set against a wall while the children gathered on low benches or simply on the ground around him. This image, a schoolmaster teaching from a wax tablet, children of mixed sex reciting, is attested in several Roman sources and represented in a handful of visual images, but the path diverged sharply after that. Boys who showed ability and whose families could afford it continued to the grammaticus, who taught literature and history and the formal analysis of texts, and then to the rhetor, who taught public speaking, the crown of Roman educated achievement, because rhetoric was the key to the courts and the senate and public life. Girls were not educated in rhetoric as a systematic program because they had no access to the arena in which rhetoric was the primary skill. A woman who could speak with the force and precision of a trained Roman orator had no legitimate public venue for those skills, except in the very limited context of pleading her own case in a court, which Roman women could do technically, though they were supposed to have a male advocate do it for them. And yet educated Roman women are everywhere in the record. Cicero praised his daughter Tullia's mind with evident pride and genuine sadness at the limits her sex placed on what that mind could do. The Emperor Augustus had Livia and Octavia, his sister, educated women both, and his own daughter Julia was described as well-read to the point that some observers found it a little alarming. The women of the philosophical schools, Stoicism, Epicureanism, are mentioned in the sources, sometimes mocked, sometimes acknowledged. There was a tradition of Pythagorean women from the Greek world that influenced early Roman thinking about women and philosophy, and there is Hypatia of Alexandria centuries later, who is the most famous example of what female intellectual life could look like when the conditions were somewhat more favorable. A woman who taught mathematics and philosophy publicly, who was respected by the men who learnt from her, who was killed by a Christian mob in 415 CE, and whose death is one of the markers historians use for the end of the classical world. Between the practical education of a Roman matron, enough literacy to manage correspondence and accounts, enough numeracy to oversee household finances, enough knowledge of the law's basics to navigate property questions, and the full intellectual life that the educated elite sometimes provided for their daughters, and that some women pursued through sheer personal force, there was a wide spectrum of Roman female intellectual engagement. The point is that the education question was not simply educated or not, it was educated for what? And the Roman answer to that question for women was heavily weighted toward the practical and the domestic, with a zone of permitted and even praised literary engagement, and a sharp boundary beyond which lay the territory of the monstrous and the unfeminine. There was a Roman woman named Hortensia, daughter of the great orator Hortensius, who in 42 BCE gave a speech in the Forum against a proposed tax on wealthy Roman women imposed to fund the Triumvir's war. She spoke publicly, she spoke well. Her speech was recorded and admired, and the sources record that the Triumvirs were initially furious and tried to have her removed, but the crowd's reaction made them back down. She achieved what she came to achieve, and then she goes back to her private life and we hear almost nothing about her again. The public voice she claimed was a one-time emergency. It was not hers to keep. Now let us think about what Roman women's friendships were like, because this is something the sources are particularly poor at capturing, and that must have been one of the central textures of Roman women's lives. The evidence we have suggests that Roman women of the same class maintained active social networks that included regular visits, correspondence, shared religious activities, attendance at each other's births and illnesses and funerals, and a whole structure of mutual support and obligation that ran parallel to the male world of patronage and clientship. The dinner party was one meeting point of these two networks, as we saw with Claudia. The baths were another. The festivals, especially the specifically female festivals like the Bona Dea celebration, were others. Roman women wrote letters to each other. We do not have many of these letters. Women's correspondence survived less well than men's, partly because the male intellectual tradition that decided what was worth copying and preserving was not particularly interested in women's letters. But we have enough fragments, enough quotations within other texts, enough references to ongoing epistolary relationships between women to know they existed, and the few we do have suggest the same range of concerns and tones that survive in any body of private correspondence. The practical and the emotional, the gossip and the advice, the complaints and the celebrations. Women visited each other during illness and childbirth in a culture where the domestic management of health was central and female. The midwife at a birth was not the only female presence. The birthing woman's female friends and relatives were expected to attend, to support, to help. This was not merely custom, it was a practical necessity in a world without hospitals and with limited medical resources. The collective female knowledge of childbirth, how to ease pain, how to position the laboring woman, when to call for the midwife, what herbs might help, how to care for a newborn in the first fragile days. This knowledge lived in the social networks of Roman women and was transmitted through them. The Roman matron's role in the wider social fabric also included the management of slaves and freed people in her household, in ways that had genuine moral weight even within the framework of an institution we rightly find monstrous. A Roman woman who treated her household slaves with consistent cruelty was criticized, not because slavery was wrong, but because excess cruelty was considered a vice of character. Moderation in the management of slaves, the occasional act of kindness, the recognition of long service with manumission, these were part of the ideal Roman mistress's character in the same way that patience and domestic skill were. The moral calculus was deeply flawed from our perspective, built on the acceptance of a system of absolute ownership. But within that calculus there was a genuine ethical consideration of how power was exercised, and Roman women of the household were its primary practitioners at the domestic level. Let us think for a few minutes about the physical experience of being a woman in Rome. Not the social structures, but the literal bodily experience. Roman women of all classes walked constantly. The Roman city was a walking city. Even for the wealthy, the litter was for longer distances and significant occasions. Day-to-day movement was on foot. The stone streets of Rome, the cobbled roads of the provinces, the uneven surfaces of Italian towns. Roman feet knew these surfaces intimately. The hobnailed sandals and shoes left physical evidence. The feet themselves, the legs, were worked in the way that only daily walking works them. The physical labor of running a household without modern appliances, the management of water, the supervision of grinding grain, the oversight of laundering, the carrying of goods, was present even for women who had slaves to do the specific tasks, because the oversight and management of physical labor is itself physical labor. Claudia climbed stairs and walked across courtyard and bent over the shrine and moved between rooms of a house built for foot traffic, not for the kind of sedentary domestic life that modern domestic space sometimes assumes. Women of the working class, slaves in agricultural contexts, freed women running their own small businesses, the wives of craftsmen working alongside their husbands, worked in ways that were genuinely physically demanding. Pottery making, weaving, bread production, fulling, these were trades in which women are documented as participants, and the work was hard. The skeletal evidence from Roman cemeteries shows patterns of wear and stress in women's bones that tell the same story. Roman women's bodies were working bodies. The Roman climate varied enormously across the empire, but Rome itself could be brutally hot in summer. The city's combination of stone, dense population, and inadequate shade made it particularly punishing, and damp and cold in winter in a way that poorly heated houses magnified. The seasonal rhythms of Roman life were genuine physical realities, not just calendar matters. The summer meant heat and the particular smell of the Tiber, the dust of the dry roads, the flies around the meat in the markets. The winter meant cold and the smoke of braziers and the shortened daylight hours and the particular quality of winter silence in a city that was quieter but never quite quiet. Roman women wore different weights of fabric in different seasons, the heavier wools of winter, the lighter linens of summer, and the Roman baths offered a particular comfort in winter that was not merely social. The warm pool, the heated room, the brief and total escape from cold that the bathhouse provided was a genuine physical pleasure in a world without central heating, and the frequency with which Romans bathed in winter, by the standards of contemporary European cultures, can partly be understood as not merely hygiene but warmth-seeking. Let us spend a few minutes on the particular Roman institution of marriage, because it shaped women's lives so completely, and it was different from what we might assume. Roman marriage was not primarily a religious ceremony. This is one of the things that makes it genuinely unusual. In the Christian West, the Church became the institution that defined and sanctified marriage, and we have tended to project a similarly religious character onto all marriage across history. But Roman marriage was fundamentally a civil and social status, established by the couple's intent, affectio maritalis, marital intent, and their cohabitation. There were forms and ceremonies and traditions, certainly. The Roman wedding had its rituals. The signing of the marriage contract, the joining of right hands before witnesses, the procession to the husband's home, the carrying of the bride over the threshold, apparently not because it was bad luck for her to trip, as the later folk explanation went, but as a symbolic transition from one household to another, the ritual untying of the knotted belts she wore. And this last detail is one that I have always found oddly touching, the practical and symbolic moment of being welcomed into a new life. But the legal establishment of the marriage was simply the couple's intention to be married, demonstrated by living together as husband and wife. And the dissolution of the marriage was similarly direct. If one party communicated to the other that they considered the marriage over, it was over. Roman divorce was easier, for both men and women, than divorce in most subsequent Western legal traditions. The grounds were not legally specified. You could divorce for any reason or no reason. The financial consequences, the return of the dowry, the custody of children, were specified and litigated. But the decision itself required no church, no state permission, nothing but the will of the parties. Women in Rome both initiated and received divorce. The historical record is full of Roman women who divorced their husbands for reasons ranging from adultery to political inconvenience to simple incompatibility. Cicero divorced Terentia after 30 years of marriage. The ancient sources differ on whose decision it was and why. The modern reader suspects it was both complicated and not entirely his. Livia divorced her first husband Tiberius Claudius Nero while she was pregnant with his child in order to marry Octavian, later Augustus, a transaction that was so politically convenient that contemporaries apparently found it suspicious in a different direction than one might expect. The point is that Roman women were not legally trapped in marriages they wanted to leave, at least not in the way that women in later Christian legal systems were trapped. The social pressure to stay, the economic calculations around dowry and property, the question of children, these were real and significant, but the legal mechanism was there. Remarriage after divorce or widowhood was common and generally unremarkable. The ideal of the univira was exactly that, an ideal praised when achieved, not always expected in practice. Roman demography was such that early marriage, high mortality, and the political use of marital alliances conspired to make remarriage common at all levels of society. A woman who lived to 50 might have had 3 or 4 marriages. A woman who died at 30 might have had 1 or 2. The lifespan and the marriage span were frequently mismatched in ways that the legal and social framework had to accommodate. Children generally stayed with the father after divorce, as the patria potestas, the father's legal power over his children, survived the dissolution of the marriage. This is one of the aspects of Roman family law that sounds most alien and potentially most painful from a modern perspective, but the actual practice seems to have been considerably more varied than the legal principle suggests. We have evidence of children spending time with both parents after divorce, of mothers maintaining close involvement with their children even when legal custody was technically with the father, of remarriage creating complex family arrangements that look rather like modern blended families. The human reality, as usual, was messier than the law intended. There is a passage in Pliny the Younger, a Roman official and writer of the late 1st and early 2nd century CE, whose letters are one of the most humanly revealing bodies of correspondence from the ancient world. There is a passage where he describes his wife Calpurnia, the way she attended every one of his public readings, listened from behind a curtain because women were not supposed to be seen at these events, and learned his speeches by heart so that she could follow the audience's response from her hidden position. Pliny finds this touching and endearing. Modern readers find it simultaneously touching and maddening. Both responses are appropriate. Calpurnia clearly loved her husband. She clearly had the intellectual capacity to engage with his work fully and eagerly. The curtain between her and the public occasion is so precisely emblematic of the whole system, present but not seen, engaged but not acknowledged. inside and outside at once. Let us turn toward the wider world of Roman women's lives in the provinces and across the empire, because Rome was not just the city on the Tiber. By the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, and the lives of women across that empire were shaped by the intersection of Roman law and culture with the existing traditions of the places Rome had absorbed. In Roman Egypt, preserved with extraordinary detail in the papyrus documents that the dry climate kept intact, we can see women of Greek and Egyptian heritage conducting legal and commercial transactions in ways that show a complexity Roman law, in theory, did not always permit. Egyptian women, in their own legal tradition, had more formal legal independence than Roman women did, and in the Roman province of Egypt, the evidence suggests a negotiation between these systems in which women navigated the rules according to local practice as much as Roman theory. We see women in the papyri lending money, buying and selling property, appearing in legal proceedings, running businesses, sometimes with a nominal male guardian who is essentially invisible in the transaction, sometimes apparently without one, the legal requirement having simply been dispensed with in the practical rush of daily life. In the western provinces, Roman Spain, Roman Gaul, Roman Britain, the evidence of women's lives comes largely from inscriptions, archaeological contexts, and legal documents, and the picture it gives is of women adapting Roman forms to local realities. The woman of a Gaulish aristocratic family who entered a Roman-style marriage with a Roman official brought her own traditions and expectations into that marriage. Her husband might find that the local expectations of a wife's role did not match Roman norms in every particular. The provinces were Rome's experiment in cultural synthesis, and women were among the primary agents and subjects of that synthesis. In Roman North Africa, the provinces of Africa Proconsularis, Numidia, Mauritania, inscriptions show women of substantial local wealth using their resources to fund public buildings, temples, games, and civic improvements in ways that echo the behavior of the elite at Rome, while also reflecting local traditions of female benefaction. A woman named Pompeia Mamea in Volubilis, modern Morocco, funded the construction of a monument. A woman in Timgad, modern Algeria, gave games to her community. Across the North African provinces, the inscription record shows women using the Roman language of public benefaction to carve their names into the civic memory of their communities. What does all of this add up to? What does it mean? The full sweep of Roman women's lives, from the bedroom to the baths, from the household account to the provincial inscription, from the woolworking to the divorce proceeding, to the dinner party to the prayer at the temple shrine. I think it means something more complicated and more interesting than either the traditional dismissal, women in Rome were oppressed and voiceless, full stop, or the overcorrection, Roman women were actually secretly powerful and practically equal. Both are true in partial ways. Both miss the fullness of the thing. Roman women lived within real and substantial constraints. They were excluded from formal political life. Their legal personhood was compromised in ways that required constant navigation. Their bodies were subject to risks and demands that had no male equivalent. The ideology that surrounded them, the constant pressure to be modest, domestic, sexually controlled, self-effacing, was a genuine psychological weight, regardless of how many individual women managed to live substantially outside it. And Roman women exercised real power in real domains: the household, the family's social network, the management of property and slaves and economic resources, the religious life of the domestic and sometimes the civic sphere, the cultural transmission of values and knowledge to the next generation, and in some cases the direct influence on political decisions that the official record pretended they could not make. The gap between those two things, the constraint and the capability, was where Roman women lived. It was narrow in some places and wide in others. It required constant negotiation. It generated both the exhausted passivity of the woman who simply performed what was required of her, and the creative maneuver of the woman who found the space between the rules and used it. What I find genuinely moving about all of this, after spending time with these women, with the Claudia I invented from the documentary evidence, with the Livia and Terentia and Sulpicia and Hortensia that history records, with the unnamed women of the papyri and the inscriptions and the graffiti and the skeletal remains, what I find moving is how recognizable it all is. Not in the specifics, which are deeply foreign, but in the deeper pattern, the intelligence looking for its right outlet, the capability in search of the domain where it can work, the private complexity behind the public simplicity of the official record, the friendships that the documents barely acknowledge, the love for children and the grief for children, the weariness that goes unrecorded because it is too ordinary to note, the small pleasures, the lamp with the running deer, the conversation that went well, the perfume that smelled right, the meal that came out better than expected, the small pleasures that are the actual texture of most of any life, ancient or modern, Roman or otherwise. These women were not distant, they were people. Their world is gone so completely that we have to reconstruct it from broken fragments and oblique references and the small stones carved with the words she was modest and faithful, and she worked wool. But behind those words, behind the formulas and the silence and the official record's determined avoidance of female complexity, there are all the things that the stones did not say because everyone who carved them already knew. She was smart, she was tired, she managed, she cared, she kept the house and the people in it and something like herself in the process, and that, in the end, was the whole of it. The lamp burns low in Claudia's house. The night has settled fully over Rome. The city outside is noisy, always noisy, inescapably noisy, but it has changed quality, moved from the day's animated purposeful noise to the night's more industrial rattle and clang. Somewhere in the distance the night watchmen are making their rounds, calling the hours in the old form that the Romans had used for generations, dividing the night's 12 hours by a voice that carried through the streets. The children are asleep. Phyllis has gone to her sleeping space. Lucius is breathing slowly beside the wall. Claudia is awake for a moment longer than she intended to be. The day's details are still moving through her mind. The conversation with Maevius, the successful meal, the small transaction at the market that she has been meaning to complete for a week, and finally did. She is composing the letter she will write tomorrow to her sister in Campania, assembling the phrases in her head as she has always done before sleep, letting the words find their form before she has a pen in her hand. She will tell her sister about the match being arranged. She will describe the new lamp she bought. She will ask, as she always asks, whether her sister's baby is well, because the baby has been unwell and it is the first question on Claudia's mind every morning, and the last one before sleep. Outside, a cartwheel grinds against stone. A dog barks in some other street. The lamp flame on the little stand by the door flexes in a draught from the window and then straightens. The night holds everything in it, all the daily weight of a life in the most extraordinary city the ancient world produced, all the routines and relationships and small negotiations that constituted a Roman woman's existence, all the unrecorded interior life behind the formula she would eventually become on a stone somewhere. And Claudia lies in the dark of her house and breathes, and the breath comes evenly, and the day lets her go. She was there, she was real, she managed and cared and moved through the world with more grace and complexity than any official record preserved. She kept the house and worked wool and was faithful and modest, and also she was a person. That is what I want you to carry from tonight. Not the facts, though the facts are worth knowing. Not the dates, though the dates give the story its shape. Just the knowledge that behind every formula, every tombstone summary, every line about domestic virtue, there was a specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable human being, living on the Aventine Hill or in a freedwoman's workshop or in a senatorial palace on the Palatine, who woke before dawn to the sounds of Rome and moved through her day with everything she had, and went to sleep at last under the same stars we are sleeping under now. So tonight, as you settle deeper under your blankets and the sounds of wherever you are grow quieter around you, let the city of Rome recede gently into the middle distance. Let Claudia's house go dark. Let the lamp go out. Let the sound of wheels on stone fade into the soft, persistent silence that eventually comes to all cities, ancient and modern, noisy and quiet. She kept the house. She worked wool. She was faithful and she was modest. And she was so much more than that, in all the ways that stone was never going to say. Sleep well tonight. The world is very old and still here, and tomorrow all the ordinary and extraordinary things begin again. But before you drift all the way off, let me tell you a few more things, because I realize there are rooms in Claudia's world we have not yet entered, streets we have not yet walked, voices we have not yet heard, and some of them deserve their time tonight. Let us talk about Roman women and money, in the direct way that the Romans themselves sometimes managed to talk about money when they weren't busy pretending the subject was beneath them. Roman dowry was not a small matter. When a woman of the propertied class married, her family provided a dowry, a dos, that was intended to contribute to the costs of the new household and that had specific legal protections attached to it. The husband managed the dowry during the marriage, but it did not become his. If the marriage ended by divorce, the dowry was legally required to be returned, with specific deductions allowed for the husband in specified circumstances, and if the wife died first, her family was supposed to recover it. The law around Roman dowry was detailed and actively litigated, and the financial stakes were real. What this meant in practice was that a Roman woman came into her marriage with assets attached to her, assets that her husband could use but not consume without legal consequence. The dowry gave the wife a kind of economic lever that was not formal authority but was not nothing either. A husband who mistreated his wife ran the risk of his in-laws demanding the return of the dowry, and the prospect of that financial loss was a genuine check on marital behavior. Not a sufficient check, not a reliable one, but present. Women also inherited. Roman inheritance law, particularly in the later Republican period, evolved in ways that gave women increasing inheritance rights. A woman could inherit from her parents, and given Rome's mortality rates and family dynamics, many women found themselves heirs to substantial estates relatively young. The administration of that inherited property was supposed to happen through a guardian, but as we have already noted, by the 1st century BCE, the guardian requirement had largely become a formality for women of the propertied class who knew how to navigate it. There is documentary evidence from Egypt primarily, but also from other parts of the empire, of Roman women acting as moneylenders, investing in commercial ventures, owning shares in ships, functioning as silent partners in trading concerns. The image of the Roman woman as purely domestic, purely concerned with household matters, is flatly contradicted by the documentary record. She was in the economy, she was putting capital to work. The men around her knew it, and the law accommodated it in its sideways Roman fashion, requiring the nominal guardian while the woman made the real decisions. Let us also talk about what happened when Roman women got things wrong by their society's standards, because the punishments and the social consequences illuminate the rules as clearly as anything else does. Adultery was the great female crime in Rome. Not the only one, but the one that organized the most significant legal machinery and generated the most literary anxiety and cultural obsession. The Lex Julia de Adulteris Coercendis, the Julian law on adultery, was enacted by Augustus around 18 BCE as part of his program of moral reform, and it made adultery a public crime rather than a private family matter for the first time in Roman legal history. Previously, the offended husband had the right to kill his wife and her lover if he caught them in the act in his own home. Now the state had a formal interest, a criminal process, courts, specified penalties. The penalties were exile and loss of property for the adulteress. The husband was obligated to divorce his adulterous wife and prosecute her. If he failed to do so within a specified time, he could be prosecuted for lenocinium, essentially acting as a pimp, which was its own significant stigma. The law caught the wife's lover as well. A Roman man could be prosecuted for adultery with a married woman, and if convicted, faced exile and penalties. What is interesting about the Augustan adultery law is not just its severity, but its context. Augustus enacted it while reportedly conducting his own affairs with various women, and while his own daughter Julia was living in a way that the law would subsequently prosecute. Julia was eventually exiled by her father under this same law, in what reads like an act of political control dressed as moral outrage. Her marriage to Agrippa had produced the heirs Augustus needed, and her subsequent activities, which involved a social circle of prominent men, whether as literary salons, sexual adventurers, or political conspirators, ancient sources disagree and modern historians continue to debate, had become problematic in ways the emperor found intolerable. He exiled her to the island of Pandateria, later to the town of Reggio, and in the 14 years before her death she was never permitted to return to Rome. Julia's story is one of the darkest in Roman women's history, not because her circumstances were uniquely extreme, but because they are so well documented that you can feel the full weight of what happened. She was used as daughters were used for political marriage, first to Marcellus, who died, then to Agrippa, more than twice her age, then to Tiberius, a match neither party wanted. She produced the children the dynasty needed. She was then punished for the life she appears to have lived on the margins of these political arrangements, punished publicly and absolutely, without appeal, by her own father. The adultery charges may have been exactly what they appeared to be, or they may have been cover for something more political. It hardly matters from where she ended up, on an island, cut off from the city that was her world, until she died there 14 years later at around 50 years old. There were women on the other side of the power equation who used the adultery laws as a weapon rather than as a threat. There is a dark episode from the reign of Tiberius, the emperor who followed Augustus, in which accusations of adultery became a tool of political destruction, with women's bodies as the proxy territory. To accuse a prominent man of adultery with a particular woman, or to accuse a woman as a means of reaching the men around her. This was a recognized tactic in the vicious political games of the early imperial court. The law that Augustus intended as moral reform became a mechanism of political persecution, and women were both its targets and sometimes its instruments. This is part of what makes Roman women's history so difficult to navigate cleanly. The structures that constrained women also gave some women particular kinds of power. The power of the woman who controls access to a powerful man's bed, the power of the woman whose respectability gives her accusations weight, the power of the woman who uses her apparent social position as a weapon. These are not sympathetic forms of power, and they were available to very few women, but they were part of the texture of Roman elite female life, and ignoring them produces a picture that is too simple to be true. Livia used the political landscape she occupied with skill that her enemies called manipulation and her admirers called wisdom. She outlived Augustus, outlived Tiberius's early reign, accumulated honors that included being granted formal immunity from the legal restrictions on women's activities, was made a priestess of the deified Augustus, and eventually was herself deified after her death, formally recognized as a goddess of the Roman state. She was 86 or 87 years old when she died, in a period when 60 was considered very old, and she had spent approximately 6 decades as the most closely observed woman in the Roman world. Whatever the truth of the darker accusations attached to her name, the ancient sources, particularly Tacitus, hint broadly at a woman willing to use poison to remove obstacles from her son Tiberius's path. The documented record shows a woman of remarkable durability, political intelligence, and the specific kind of patience that outlasting all your enemies requires. There is something to sit with there. Not admiration exactly, not condemnation, just recognition of what the circumstances produced. A woman of extraordinary intelligence and capability born into a world that had one legitimate role for her. She filled that role and used every margin it gave her. That is not a story about freedom, but it is a story about what human beings do with the shape available to them. Let us go back to something more ordinary, something closer to the ground level of Roman women's experience, because I have been spending time with the elite and there is a whole world below that line that deserves attention. The Roman streets were full of women working, not just the ornatresses and the midwives and the mid-level household managers like Mary. Women of lower classes and freed women and slave women worked in almost every economic sector the Roman city contained, and the evidence for this is both in the documentary record and the physical record of the buildings and artifacts. Women ran food stalls and thermopolia, those fast food counter establishments where hot food was sold from the stone counters embedded in the street-facing walls of buildings, the circular openings in the stone still visible in Pompeii with the vivid colour of the terracotta vessels that once sat in them. Women ran popine, the wine shops where ordinary Romans drank standing at a counter. Women ran brothels. Some of the women who ran them had been prostitutes themselves, had saved or manoeuvred enough to acquire property and manage others. Women worked as weavers, as dyers, as spinners in the textile industry that was one of Rome's major productive sectors. Women worked as fruit sellers, as bread sellers, as vendors of the small items that were traded in Rome's street-level economy. Women worked as nurses, nutrix, the woman who nursed a child not her own, sometimes as slaves, sometimes as freed women paid for the service, and the relationship between a Roman child and their nutrix could be one of the central emotional relationships of that child's life. There are Roman inscriptions of adults commemorating their former nurses with genuine and unguarded grief. Women practiced medicine, primarily as midwives, obstetrics, but also in broader capacities. There are inscriptions that identify women as medica, physician, and at least some of these seem to represent genuine medical practice rather than merely an honorific title. The ancient sources occasionally acknowledge women practitioners with various degrees of surprise and condescension. Siranius, writing about midwifery, specifies the qualities of a good midwife. She should be literate, have good memory, love work, be respectable in conduct, have sound understanding, with a matter-of-factness that suggests female medical practice was a social reality his text did not need to argue for, but only to specify. Women worked as actresses and performers, a category that Roman law treated as more or less equivalent to prostitution in terms of social status. Both were infames, legally disreputable, outside the protection of laws that governed assaults on respectable women. This was not a minor thing. The distinction between the femina honesta, the respectable woman, and the infamous performer meant that violence against the latter was legally treated very differently from violence against the former. The law protecting Roman women from sexual assault specifically excluded prostitutes, actresses, and women of the street, which is to say it excluded the women who were most in need of protection. And yet the women who made careers in performance were not simply victims of this system. Roman entertainment was a significant cultural institution, and the women who performed in it, in pantomime, in mime, in theatrical productions, in the musical performances that accompanied Roman festivals and private celebrations, occupied a strange dual space, socially disreputable and professionally central. The famous actress could be both mocked and adored. She could accumulate wealth if she was successful. She could have powerful protectors. She was outside the category of the respectable matron, and that exclusion from respectability also meant exclusion from the respectable matron's constraints. An actress could live in ways that a Claudia could not. The social cost was real and significant. So was the freedom that came with it. Rome was also a city of enormous religious variety by the late Republic and early imperial period, and women's engagement with foreign religious cults was one of the culturally charged issues that Roman male writers returned to repeatedly. The cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, was one of the most popular in the Roman world, and it attracted a disproportionate number of female devotees, or at least the Roman sources who disapproved of it framed it that way. Isis was a goddess of remarkable appeal, a divine mother, a powerful healer, a goddess who had rescued and resurrected her murdered husband Osiris, a figure of active, effective divine power. Her cult offered women a religious role that was more direct and less circumscribed than the official Roman state religion. Women served as her priests. They participated in elaborate rites of initiation. They felt, apparently, a personal relationship with the goddess that the official Roman religious forms did not provide. They kept the house, they worked wool, they were faithful and modest, and they were alive, which is the thing the stone cannot quite contain no matter how precisely it is carved. The lamp goes out now. The house is dark. Rome goes on doing its impossible noisy thing outside the walls, and in the quiet of a bedroom on the Aventine Hill, in a city that has been gone for 1,000 years and that we are still, in some essential way, living inside. In that bedroom, a woman breathes and sleeps and is for a few more hours in the world. Good night, sleep well. The history is all around us, and it is full of people, and tonight they were here with us for a little while.